I'm Liron Cohen.
I'm Corinne Ellie.
And we are changing the conversation about eating disorders.
This is a companion episode to our episode on pathological altruism, in which we hosted Dr. Rachel Bachner-Melman. And this companion episode really grew through the editing process. So as I'm sure you all know, after we record an episode, we listen to it several times. And what Liron and I noticed was that as we were listening to the episode again and again and again, the word pathological just became, it just grew in proportions, and it really started to bother us. So I know that in the episode itself, we asked Rachel some questions about the use of the word pathological, and we challenged this concept, but we continued the conversation between us after the episode was recorded, and we thought it'd be a good idea to share some of our reflections with you.
I think to me the thing that stood out the most about the word pathological is, again, that many, many years after I've already recovered from the eating disorder, I still kept relating certain parts of who I am to pathology. And that's because during my teenage years, during the time when I think it's most critical for us to get to know ourselves and kind of construct our identity, I was in therapy throughout most of those years, and almost everything that I heard in the conversation, whether or not it was actually said literally, the word pathology, was a certain part of myself or part of my disorder. And so I just learned to make that connection, that this part of who I am is a sick part, is a pathological part. And I have actually had to retrain my brain to look at these parts of myself in a different way, because it's really not, ironically, a healthy way to live.
And when you mentioned that to Rachel during the episode, Rachel acknowledged that maybe the word pathological is not the best word to use, but that we're sort of stuck because it's part of the lingo of psychology and psychiatry. And that made me think, why aren't we changing that lingo? I mean, there are potentially so many other terms we can use to express the same idea.
It's not just the lingo, it's the attitude. Because as I said to Rachel, the word was rarely used in therapy, with me anyway, but it was the attitude. And the lingo, of course, words mean a lot, and when we use it in medicine and psychology, it enforces this attitude, and then of course it's a cycle. And I, even though I didn't hear the word, I could sense the attitude of my therapists, of my the people who were supposed to be treating me, and I sensed that it carried the meaning of this is wrong, this is sick. And again, it's a very fine line. Like Rachel said, it's not all sick or all healthy. It's a matter of balance. It's a matter of how you use it, of how much there is of it. And so I think that it's not just the word, it's the attitude. But the word, of course, carries that meaning and enforces the attitude.
One thought that I was mulling over after that episode was, what if instead of calling this pathological altruism, a different term would have been used, like something like self-denial, or being other-centered, or anything else that doesn't necessarily pathologize a certain behavior and doesn't characterize particular personality traits as somehow not okay.
Especially since, as I mentioned in the podcast, actually emphasizing the positives about my natural tendency to be altruistic, to want to help others, emphasizing those positives would have been extremely healing for me and would have helped me begin to find an alternative identity to my eating disorder that had become my identity. So we're talking about identity. We have a whole series of podcasts dedicated to identity, and I think that instead of maybe looking at it from the angle of pathology, to have looked at it from an angle of this is something that's obviously a big part of who you are. How can we make it a good thing? How can we make it something that makes you feel rewarded and satisfied and gives you a sense of self? That would have been a huge step towards helping me find myself.
Yeah, and that links to something that you also said during the episode, which is when you were a patient, you were made to feel like every part of you is somehow pathological or is somehow related to having an eating disorder. And it was as if like the diagnosis was swallowing up all elements of who you were.
Absolutely. And oftentimes it really upset me that certain things about myself that I actually felt good about or that I felt were a big part of my personality were reduced to just part of the disorder. And it made it very hard for me to both develop a healthy relationship with myself and fully come to appreciate all of the aspects in me and differentiate them from the eating disorder, because we always talk about how the eating disorder consumes a person and becomes, we identify with the disorder fully. And it's so hard in treatment to try to separate those two, but it's especially hard when in therapy, many of the aspects of who you are reduced to just a part of your disorder.
And I think this brings up another issue that I had with pathological altruism as a term and also as a concept. It individualizes a set of behaviors and attitudes that might actually be socially coded. Individuality differs from culture to culture. So although particular ways of being an individual and relating to others might be considered supposedly healthy in certain societies, this would not be the case in other societies. And I feel like terms like pathological altruism fail to capture the cross-cultural diversity in the way that people interact with one another, in the way that people are networked, and also in the way that the self and personhood are conceptualized in different societies. I guess what I'm trying to say is that altruism is so culturally coded. And it's really difficult to judge it by any kind of universal standard. And what a term like pathological altruism does is imply that there is a right and a wrong way to practice altruism, and that somehow being right or wrong about it is down to the individual.
And I think also that, again, it would be very beneficial to maybe focus rather than the altruistic part and whether or not it's good. And again, like we said, it changes from culture to culture. I think maybe it would be more beneficial to focus on the self and how can the person still take care of themselves and be able to maybe maintain as much altruism as makes that person happy and fulfilled, as long as it doesn't have a negative effect on who they are and how they live their lives, and as long as it doesn't negate their sense of self.
So we recognize that each discipline has its own way of conceptualizing and naming certain phenomena. And we also feel that it's really important to bring diverse disciplines into conversation. And so we're really happy that we had a chance to converse with Rachel and to engage with a concept from psychology. But at the same time, we also feel that it's important for us to challenge this concept and also encourage dialogue beyond this episode. And we'd also like our listeners to engage in this conversation. And we'd like to hear from you. How do you feel about the term pathological altruism? How do you feel about this concept? What might be some alternatives that would be preferable?
What was your experience with the word or the attitude and how it made you feel?
Do you have any alternative terms to suggest? And what would those be? We'd love to hear from you, so please feel free to get in touch with us over email or Twitter or through our Facebook page. This is just the beginning of the conversation about this and the issue of naming and conceptualizing is something that we definitely like to explore further in future episodes. Thank you for joining us in Changing the Conversation. Feel free to email us at any time with comments, questions, or anything else to changetheconvoed@gmail.com.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media, where we also have links to other resources and further reading. Look for Changing the Conversation About Eating Disorders on Facebook and at ChangeConvoED on Twitter.
We hope you join us again for our next episode on the first Tuesday of next month.